This is Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another amazing, titillating episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. My name is Joel. I'm here with the dude, the man, the myth, a scholar and a gentleman, T-Dog Hunter. How you doing, buddy?
The Deuterino, man. Strikes and gutters, ups and downs, you know?
Strikes and gutters. No spares.
Yeah.
Nothing in between.
No spares. Nope. Yep, that's right.
Today we're going to be talking about honesty. And by way of exploring this through just the way that we as human beings lie as a species, I want to title this Everyone is Lying, as a way to just invite us into this reality. I feel like we don't talk enough about how common deception is, how often we who think we're so honest actually are lying all the time. So we'll dive into the ethical definitions, dissect it with an example that's coming along that I know you're pretty passionate about, Trent. But to start out, let's start light. The dictionary defines, I'm going to read this, defines a white lie as a harmless or trivial lie, especially one told to avoid hurting someone's feelings. So for me, I've often engaged in white lies when a loved one, usually a female, asks me, how do these clothes work? Or, how do they look? How's my makeup? Or whatever it may be. And for the most part, if I have a strong opinion, I'll share it and I'll try and do it as tactfully as possible. But if I don't have a strong opinion, what I tend to do is I will just be encouraging. If I don't have a strong opinion, I might even say that. Say, I don't have a strong opinion on this. I think you look great. Even if you really dove into my actual opinion, I might be like, meh. But in that kind of situation, it doesn't serve the purpose. Sometimes we have somewhere to go and there's time that needs to be saved. Or sometimes I'm watching someone I love being in kind of a place of insecurity. And I'll tell them, no, it looks great. Hoping that would help them feel better. So, Trent, what do you think about my logic of telling white lies? And can you think of an example where you might employ similar tactics?
Bill, I mean, I'm here to tell you today that I've never, ever once engaged in white lies. And that right there is not a white lie. It's a bad lie. No, of course, man. I mean, the logic is sound. Obviously, the logic is sound. There are times when you just want to smooth it over. You want people to feel good. This question, I think, is a really good one. It raises a larger question about sort of the cost of telling the truth, the cost to sort of the lubrication of daily interactions with other human beings. It raises the question of how much truth can we handle as human beings? How much do we want? When we ask a question of somebody, are we wanting to get the truth from them, or are we just wanting affirmation? There are probably times when we want the truth. There are other times when, truth be told, we want affirmation.
Yep.
So I don't know that we as human beings always want the truth. And I think that human beings, all of us, are basically engaging in certain levels of deception very regularly. And I don't regard these as pernicious. I think we'll talk more about what would be sort of moral and immoral, or maybe in your words, beautiful and ugly forms of lying. But when we dress up well and we wear a smile, but we're really not in a good mood, that's a form. That's wearing a mask. That's not being authentic necessarily.
Sure.
When we exchange pleasantries at a party, when we say nice things about someone's hometown, when we really can't stand it, these are moments when we're deceiving or engaging in white lies. And I don't think that most people would object to that kind of behavior, because that's simply the way that we smooth things over.
Yep. I'm into that. So ultimately, I want to be able to create a gradient for us to kind of talk about deception and where it is, and the different flavors of deception that go along that spectrum. So in the ethics of lying, there's a couple terms closely related that I want to posit to you. First one is evasion. So generally, this refers to like dodging a question, not addressing a question directly. And so that's what would be called evasion. And then there's equivocation, intentionally using ambiguous language with multiple interpretations to mislead or confuse. So it is a form of evasion technically, but it specifically uses vague or unclear definitions for the purpose of deception. Whereas evasion by itself may simply be avoiding a direct answer with distraction or ignoring the question altogether. Equivocation has a specific way of doing it, and I want to highlight this with a poem that I found online. It's attributed to Benjamin Franklin, but who knows who actually wrote it. But the title of it is Equivocation. So let me read this. Some have learnt many tricks of sly evasion. Instead of truth, they use equivocation, and eke it out with mental reservation, which to good men is an abomination. Our smith of late most wonderfully swore that whilst he breathed, he would drink no more. But since I know his meaning, for I think he meant he would not breathe while he did drink. So, Trent, any thoughts on these terms?
No, it's a very good distinction. I think it's important. I mean, first of all, just to preface it with the ethics of lying, sort of that there could be an ethics of it. When the sort of the classic example is, you're hiding Jews during World War II as the Nazis are coming through your town, and do you? I never seemed like a moral quandary to me. The knock at the door. Do you have Jews? No, I don't. Yep. I don't. Okay. Yeah. But for people who are worried about going to hell, there's a question: is it okay to do that? So that's kind of the classic sort of moral quandary,
It's so silly.
But as we move towards the gradient of sort of what is truth telling, generally speaking, when you're asked a question, yes, there's basic sort of evasion, dodging a question, and then there's equivocation, which seems to be a little darker. It might be sort of part and parcel of gaslighting, where you turn the tables on somebody else to make it seem like they have misunderstood something. They can't see the truth. They're wrong for thinking that you're wrong. This kind of a thing. So equivocation can, if we're doing the Venn diagram thing, there's like outright lies and equivocation, and then there's sort of that little space right there where equivocation can feel like lying, and it certainly has the intention of misleading people about what you think, and then leaving them more confused than when they started. I think it's one of the worst forms of answering, Joel, because I think when someone asks you a question, you could say, I don't know. You could, as a simple evasion, say, I don't want to answer that. I don't want to answer. I don't know. You could speak explicitly and clearly, and then you could also equivocate, which is usually the telltale sign of equivocation. It usually involves many words strung together that are about 7 or 8 syllables apiece that goes on for about 7 paragraphs instead of like 2 sentences. That's not a dead giveaway for equivocation, but it's very, very reliable.
All right, so you're kind of teeing this up a bit. Let's dive into some real life examples. I feel like we could pick a ton of people, especially when you're thinking about social media, you're thinking about politics, just anyone basically in the public sphere. There's so many people that use these tools for their own messaging. But I hear you have a specific criticism of our friend Jordan Peterson, whom we've done a whole episode around, and we talk about Jordan Peterson like he's a mixed bag. Like I think we titled it The Limitations of Jordan Peterson, but half of that episode we talked about the good things that we enjoyed from Jordan Peterson and the things he's brought in terms to as an intellectual, like what can I ponder, think about things differently. But he obviously now has his own like brand. And there's this episode, it's an interview with Richard Dawkins. You can tell me more about it, but where He uses evasion and perhaps equivocation. So first, help us understand where you appreciate Jordan Peterson, and then tell us about how you see Jordan Peterson falling into some of these question dodging techniques.
Well, Jordan Peterson, I think, has been a great advocate for free speech, which I think in our world is under attack. And it is really at the bedrock of our democracy, if you want to call the U.S. a democracy. So he's been
Sometimes
a great.
I don't.
I know. Our Republican experiment, Republican in generic terms there.
Yeah.
I think that he's been a great advocate of free speech, and he's actually come together with people who are politically and philosophically not in alignment with him to debate in favor of strong free speech. So he's been very good, and I think that his insights on sociology and psychology, which is where his level of expertise is, are fantastic. I think that he's very, very good in those areas. And so many people have, particularly young men, have really, really taken a liking to Jordan Peterson over the past 7 or 8 years. And I think as a result of that he has been catapulted onto this sort of platform of being a public intellectual. And I think there are certain areas, let's say with economics, with politics, and and in particular with religion, that he's just not super knowledgeable. He's definitely not a subject matter expert when it comes to the field of religion. Now, that doesn't mean that he can't speak publicly about it. It does mean that he needs to contextualize what he has to say, and he needs to preface it with maybe some more humility and less dogmatism. In a recent interview, I think this came out 2 or 3 weeks ago, but he did a debate / conversation with Richard Dawkins, and it was moderated by a semi-well-known atheist who has his own YouTube channel called Alex O'Connor. And Alex was moderating this conversation between Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson. And they talked about a variety of things, but one of the themes that they came to for a while was that of the historicity of certain biblical things, like the virgin birth, like the resurrection, like Cain and Abel. Dawkins was trying to ask Jordan Peterson, do you think that Cain and Abel were real people? Do you think that they're actually that Jesus was born of a virgin and that Jesus died and was raised again? And when he asked Jordan Peterson these questions, Jordan struggled mightily to give what any normal person would consider as a direct answer to these things.
Sure.
And as we've already discussed, Jordan could have just simply evaded it by saying, well, I don't think these are important questions, or, well, this, that, and the other. And he also could have just said, I don't know. Or he could have said, no, they're not historical, or yes, they are historical. And instead, he engaged in what I think you and I would both say qualifies as equivocation.
Yeah.
Going on and on about how these stories have become such a part of the narrative structure of our genetic culture, where phenomenologically and morphologically they're so intertwined that, and he does the finger thing too, where I don't know how a person could parse those out. I don't even know what resurrection could mean, he says. He says things like that. So he takes you down this rabbit hole of metaphor, and it's almost like the William James. It's so real to the people that it becomes real. And at the end of the day, he's like, it would take me 2 days to answer a question about was Jesus raised, knowing full well that 99.9% of people who've ever asked the question, was Jesus really raised from the dead? And Paul the Apostle knew this. He knew this in 1 Corinthians 15 when he said, if Jesus is not raised from the dead, then our faith is in vain, and we are of all men most pitiable. He knew, Paul the Apostle knew, that that the real game here is, was Jesus actually raised from the dead, or was he not? Now, of course, there could be other, that question could be working at multiple levels. It could be that there's great metaphorical and spiritual significance to the
Yeah.
idea of being raised from the dead. But when people are asking that, they generally know. And Jordan Peterson could simply say, how are you asking that question?
Yeah.
Are you asking literally? And then he would just say, no, literally, I don't think he was raised from the dead, or yes, I do. It's like he doesn't want to be pinned down as a fundamentalist, and he doesn't want to be pinned down as an atheist. And I think the big thing that's happening, Joel, is this is what I suspect, when he's being asked that question, he's like, if I answer this wrongly, I may lose my 8th vacation home. He's like, he's just kind of running the numbers. Like, I could lose, let's see, right now I've got 30 million
Yep.
people. If I lose like 5 million, that's a reduction in about, you know what I mean? So
Mhm.
I don't fault Jordan for being really successful at what he does. But if you are unwilling to give straightforward answers for fear that you're going to lose out on a part of your base, how can we take you seriously as a public intellectual? Because the sine qua non of a public intellectual is, I need to be able to think that you take your answers seriously,
Yep.
and you take the questions seriously. There. You got
Yeah.
me. You got me hot and bothered.
I love it. I want you to be hot and bothered. Yeah, you sent me that interview, and man, it was hard to watch, Trent. I just watched Jordan Peterson in your fantastic high pitch impersonation of him. Just like try and just basically don't. It felt like it was sleight of hand. Just like, don't look at the man behind the curtain. Like, look at all this other big long words. And I mean, you just saw like Richard Dawkins sitting across from him with like a little smirk on his face, and even the Alex O'Connor's just like, hey, I'm asking you a question, and I'm wondering why you're not able to answer it. Like, an answer could be, I don't know. Is that what you're saying? And then he goes off on one of those things again. And it's just like, I'm sure there are those who will live and die by Jordan Peterson. And their egos can't handle that he may be wrong, or he may be flawed, right? And that's how Jordan Peterson is relying on those kinds of people to stay in his camp. But anyone who's not that, you watch that interview, and I feel exactly like you do. Like, you clearly have strong feelings and answers about all these things, but you waffle here. And the only logical reason I can come up with is that he's trying to like appease his base and doesn't want to be honest about how he thinks and feels about it, because he knows that's going to lose him money. And golly, it's so hard to watch that. I kind of felt similar when Rob Bell was going through some of this back in the day, when famous pastor, it felt like every other month was on some major CNN, Fox, whatever. He was constantly being interviewed. He was writing bestseller books. And then when he wrote Love Wins, and they were trying to get him to talk about, does he believe that hell is real? And he would go off on these long circular conversations about the metaphor of hell. Well, like when you talk to people, they say hell is real now, and so hell is a lot of different things. And that's where I feel like he shot himself in the foot. I was just like, Rob, just tell everyone, I don't believe in it in the way that I was taught as a kid and most people in churches believe. I believe in it this way. Just say that. And you already had the falling out of all the people who called you a heretic, so you might as well just be honest about it. And that's what I feel with Jordan Peterson. He is shooting himself in the foot because he's for whatever reason thinks he can have his cake and eat it too. You can't be a public intellectual and not offer your actual opinions on things. That's just, I don't see how that's even possible.
Yeah, I don't understand it. I mean, and I wonder too, like, I don't know to what extent he would really lose his so-called base
Yeah.
if he would shoot straight with this. Maybe it's true if he identified as an agnostic that he would lose some people, or it might be true that if he identified as sort of as
Literalist.
like as an evangelical, if he would lose, it's possible he would lose some people. Maybe he is rightly scared, but I don't know. It does seem to make him look fairly sheepish and ridiculous when he continues to answer that way. And again, he's been given outs. I mean, look at O'Connor said, "You could say I don't know,"
Yeah.
and that would be a viable answer. But he chooses the route of equivocation,
Mm-hmm.
and part of it is the effect it has on people is to make you as the questioner sort of like, wait, is it possible for there to be a simple answer to this question? Maybe there isn't. And again, it has a little bit of that gaslighting feel, like,
Yeah.
oh, maybe this is more complicated than I could have ever imagined that it would be.
It's not.
I don't know, man. I get such a kick out of it, and then sometimes I get mad and I have to turn off the video too. So,
Yeah.
Oh man.
I just watched maybe half of that interview, and I turned it off, just going like, man, what a coward. That's how I felt. Which
even if I could,
go ahead.
If I can chime in just quickly too, like, just so people don't think, oh, I'm hating on like conservative voices. I was a huge fan of, am a huge fan of the late Christopher Hitchens, who died in 2011. As a public intellectual, he was a journalist and so forth. And I think there were times when he didn't have great answers to questions. I don't know if I wouldn't put in the category necessarily of equivocation, but like a lot of times he was pressed as an atheist on the foundations of his morality. And I'll be honest, as somebody who describes myself as an atheist, it's not an easy solve for how we come up with morals. Now, my quick answer to a lot of questions about what's my foundation for moral behavior is we're moral animals. We've evolved that way. We require solidarity as humans, but that still doesn't answer that doesn't help us escape the arbitrariness of moral edicts, because people could always turn around on me and say, well, that might just be your personal preference. Is there any reason to think that that's morally fundamental? And I think Christopher Hitchens wanted to get away with moral fundamentalism, as it were, if I can coin that phrase. He wanted to get away with moral fundamentalism, but he really didn't have the foundation. It was just this is moral. Everybody knows that. I always felt his answers were weak on that, and it might have been an area for further research on his part, or it might have been an area where he should have taken the option of saying, I really don't have a good answer. I'll keep searching and working on it, but I don't have a good answer for you. He wasn't willing to say that. So I don't applaud him for that omission.
Yeah. I mean, the famous one of our times was when Bill Clinton got up and gave his speech after going through his arraignments and with Monica Lewinsky, and he said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anyone to lie, not a single time, never." And the equivocation in there is just like, you immediately think, but what do you mean by sexual relations? Like there's this, it's where you're using terms that could mean multiple things, and you just let people think what they do, but you actually never said anything of merit. It's like you weren't clear at all, and intentionally. So this leads into another form of a deception that I find fascinating, and it's a bit of a curveball. There's this form of deception is often classified as self-deception, and the word is delusion. In terms of psychology, delusion is defined a fixed false belief that is resistant to reason or confrontation with actual fact. So in most cases, delusions are coping mechanisms that help us kind of live in a world where it's hard for us to cope with reality and truths. Delusions protect the person because that person, for whatever reason, lacks the mental stability or emotional maturity to face reality. Now, there are extreme cases like this. I'm thinking of movies like Shutter Island, where Leonardo DiCaprio's character suffered something extreme and has created this false narrative, this delusion that he lives within. Or there's another movie, Life of Pi, is based on the novel, where you find out that this story is really it's a whole delusion that he's made for himself so that he doesn't have to look at the hard truths in the face. Now, these are horrendous happenings, but in those cases, we would never fault, I think, an individual for creating those delusions in order to keep going. But most delusions aren't that extreme. And some might be still very painful. There's the kind of the common example of the battered wife who deludes herself that her husband's drinking isn't that bad. Or you might watch someone who spends decades chasing down their dreams in Hollywood. And this guy deludes himself that it's just around the corner, it's going to happen, and it doesn't. And he's ignoring the impact on his health, the impact on his family relations, or whatever it may be. So when you talk about that, some people are deluded in terms of like they're voters who, against all evidence, believe that Donald Trump's a moral person. Right? It's just,
yeah, right.
I don't, and it's so interesting to me how people come up with these delusions and they find something that their ego wants to believe, and they put their hands over their ears and they're just la 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 la. And I have experience with this. I was really close to someone who was a very intelligent, but I believe deluded person as well. And it's hard when someone is confident in their delusions and they have the intelligence to communicate their delusions because they feel so true. Because personally, I think a deluded person is speaking the truth. They're speaking their truth. The problem is that their truth is flowing from a lie that they told themselves. So when we delude ourselves, when we lie to ourselves, we end up lying to everyone. It's kind of the phrase I use. So Trent, what are your thoughts about delusion? Do you ever think that some of the bullshit we hear might be better classified as delusion rather than intentional deception?
And it's an excellent question. I mean, what I don't know that I could add a lot of great stuff to what you've just shared, but it is an interesting distinction. When is someone just spewing bullshit that they know is false, and when is somebody actually actively deluding themselves that they really believe the lies? It's hard. It's hard to prove that someone's believing their own lies, but I do think that this is something that happens, where people become such inveterate liars that it's such a part of their daily lives that they're living in a separate reality. I think it's especially true with people who have not had the experience of being a subordinate. They've had subordinates, but they've not really been a subordinate for much of their like working and adult lives. And we've seen this the case with political figures. We've seen it the case with some high profile celebrity pastors who surround themselves with yes men. They get rid of people who tell them. Dude, I've seen this. I'm sure you've seen it too. These pastors, big shot pastors of these megachurches, if you are a dissenting voice, whether you're a church member or you are a part of the staff, if you're a dissenting voice, they get rid of you because they just can't be told these things. They learn to live in these reality distortion bubbles, and whatever they say, so there's so many people telling them that's great and that's the truth that I think, of course, you would lose touch with reality. You would lose touch with how most normal people's lives go, where they're constantly rubbing against the law of gravity. Figuratively and metaphorically, literally and figuratively. So these I think that it's a really good question. I don't know how to prove it, but I do think that there are a lot of people who are not just spewing bullshit and saying, "Ha, I know this is false," but they think that it's true. And they're very, 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 very defensive about it. So I don't know. Not. I don't know if I've thought this one through as much, but I think you do a good job of describing it and putting it out there. So,
well, I'm curious. I'm going to see if you would be willing to explore where you might have had a delusion or something. Maybe a softer way of saying it is the stories we tell ourselves. That's the phrase I tend to use, is because our brain are constantly creating stories around everything, whatever data we get. And I think about like a buddy of mine who's a recovered alcoholic now. He's been sober, I think, for 6-7 years, but he was in sales, still is. But when he was younger, he was just like, Man, I drink a lot, but I have to do it for my job. And I remember him telling me that right up the front, and it was very clear that this was a story. Years later, he's, hit rock bottom or whatever and started doing, getting recovery. And I was having conversations and he brought that back to my attention. He said, remember, Joel, when I used to tell myself that I have to drink because of work? And now I'm doing the same job and I'm not drinking. I mean, I do, have these gigantic bills and someone will ask who drank, like, who spent $100 on Voss waters. And he's like, that was me. But they're cheaper.
Yeah.
They're cheaper than the booze. Um, but it's interesting to me how we can create these stories. And I had all kinds of stories about myself, Trent, primarily around trying to tell myself, oh, I'm not very good at like being a leader, or I'm not very good at like with conflict. And I had all these stories that really were just put up there because I was insecure and I wasn't ready yet to step into these spaces where I was going to be, less confident. And so I'm curious if you have some examples.
Well, you have said before when I've shared with you about my life, you'll say something like, Trent, those are what I'm hearing right now are stories that you're telling yourself, tales that you're spinning to help you negotiate whatever you perceive is the real world. And so this is again going back to how we all deceive. I think we do all delude ourselves. I think that one of the things that I've had to confront in my life is assuming that the worst will happen and preparing myself for that. So that could be, I assume that this person is not going to respond to me well. I assume that this person is unhappy with me. I assume that I won't make a good impression of these kinds of things. And those are stories and delusions that I'm engaging in for protective reasons, not because I have good reasons necessarily to believe that. So I'm creating a reality that maybe feels better for myself. So I think that is a part and parcel of being a human being, is deluding ourselves where we're not confronting, we're not really asking what is the reality out there. We're saying, what is the reality that I can construct so that I can get through this thing unscathed? And that might be necessary to protect ourselves from things, traumas that we've experienced in the past, but it also is like skin that needs to be shed.
Yeah.
So
yes, both of those. Absolutely. So I want to kind of pivot here then, and let's kind of talk about positive ways to move forward. We've talked about evasion, equivocation. We threw some shot some arrows over at Jordan Peterson and his absolute refusal to just answer direct questions when he sees them. They're threatening perhaps his brand or whatever. But what do we do as individuals to become more honest? And the word I like is integrity. The word, and I had to rephrase it. I don't know about you, like growing up evangelical, the word integrity was often used as this weird catch-all, like you need to be perfect at all things that are moral, which is primarily you don't lust, and if you do lust, you have no integrity. Would you say that that's pretty similar to kind of the messages you heard growing up?
yes, exactly. Yes, integrity could be swapped out for perfection in a sense.
Yeah. So I do not use that word in that way. I think about integrity. I learned about this in a program called Landmark Forum that I really appreciated. They use the term integrity like a bridge. When a bridge has integrity, it means it's functioning the way it's supposed to function, and you can walk on it, and it serves the purpose it's supposed to serve. When it's not, when it doesn't have integrity, it means something's out of alignment. It means something is decaying and needs to be repaired. So when I think about my own personal integrity, I'm looking at, am I aligned? Am I saying what I mean? Am I meaning what I say? Am I really reflected on my intentions? And do I think am I aware of whether my intentions are to help or to harm? And so that's what I mean by integrity. What is it? So for you, what are some ways that you pursue honesty and integrity for yourself.
Yes. Well, I would go along with what you're saying about kind of how you're defining integrity, and that it's like a reliable structure, like a bridge. It does what it's supposed to do. I think that all of us have um, a self. If we,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's a useful fiction, but I think I think that's a useful concept of the self, which is to say, there's kind of like that inviolable part of us that's sort of our core. And when we start to violate that, we become aware of it. That might be where conscience kicks in. Some people have said conscience is like the inner daemon, Daemon, or the spirit, which reminds us you're supposed to be this thing. This is the standard that you have for yourself. And when you depart from that, you start to become a different person. And I think probably I've had in the past a hyperactive conscience as a fundamentalist, hypersensitive Christian. But it might be better to be able to rein that in than to not have it at all and try to create a conscience. But I like to think that I've been aware of what my standard is, and I try to live up to that standard. When I don't, I become aware. I feel anxiety, I feel self-hatred, these kinds of things, and guilt. Again, some of those go more than they should. I might be hypersensitive, but I want to combine a little concept here, Joel, of um, being a person of integrity and also a person of skill. And what I am saying here is being the kind of person who uses words in a way that are truthful, but also reflect the need to live skillfully in a world where you can easily misstep. Even by telling the truth, you can do harm to yourself and others by telling the truth in the wrong way and in the wrong tone or with wrong words. One of the great examples of somebody who was a skillful truth teller and person of integrity was Thomas More, who was basically a lawyer and a judge, and eventually ascended for a very brief time as the Lord Chancellor of England during the time of Henry VIII. Now, historically, there's Thomas More, and he had some darkness to him for sure, but he is depicted in one of my favorite movies, A Man for All Seasons, which is based upon the screenplay by Robert Bolt. It won Best Picture in 1966, and in this movie, Thomas More is sort of at the peak of his career, and he's this highly skilled judge, very prominent in England, he knows Henry VIII very well, so he's constantly rubbing shoulders with the powerful. But he's also a devout Catholic, and this was at a time when the Catholic Church, where it was starting to be less safe to be Catholic, because the inception of the Church of England was just right around the corner, when basically King Henry VIII declared himself as the head of the Church of England, so he could get his divorce from Catherine and move on to Anne, and then I think it was 7 other wives that he had or something. It was kind of dangerous to be his wife. But anyway, this neither here nor there. Thomas More finally was brought to a place where Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. He wanted basically the Catholic Church to say that the marriage had been invalid. And so then Henry was requiring that sort of all the leaders in England and the church and so forth would sort of sign off that his divorce was invalid, that his marriage to Catherine was invalid, and that he could get a divorce. Thomas wouldn't do it. He refused to give his consent to that. Well, then he was asked to give an oath stating that the papal successor, papal supremacy, sort of was valid, and he wouldn't say exactly what his thoughts were, but he wouldn't take the oath. So he evaded the question of whether or not he affirmed that, but he did that by saying, "I'm just not going to take the oath." Long story short, eventually Thomas More was taken to trial, where he was found guilty, I believe, of high treason for his refusal to take the oath of the act of succession and to recognize that King Henry was indeed the legitimate head of the church and the Church of England. So anyway, he paid a steep price for his refusal to do this thing. But in the movie, what's so fantastic is you see how he uses his skills as a lawyer and as a judge to speak truth when he needed to and when the time really demanded it, but basically to decide, hey, I know that, going back again, this is a long-winded answer, but he was a guy who knew which hill he was going to die on. He wasn't going to die before that, but he knew what the line was that he wouldn't let himself cross.
Yep.
And when it came time to be tempted to cross that line, he basically decided, I would rather die than cross that line. Yep. So he did a lot of sort of clever maneuvering during the time of his imprisonment and his trial. But when it came down to it, he refused to sign off on an oath that would have been a violation of his conscience. So I regard at least the fictionalized or semi-fictionalized version of him in this story as a great example of somebody who combined cleverness and wit with that understanding of sort of the hill that he would actually be willing to die on. So, yeah.
That's a great answer, because it's not like a straightforward, here's, some like American myth of George Washington, I cannot tell a lie, I cut down the cherry tree, or whatever it may be. But here's someone that's has a form of integrity. They're in alignment with themselves, but they're also they're savvy, right? They're savvy.
That's right.
And they know how to
That's right.
to operate in those spaces. Personally, I think I would be a terrible politician. There's no way I get voted into anything, because I'm not interested in manipulating people. Even if they are dumb, I don't want to manipulate them to like me. I want them to, I want to teach them to think for themselves and really find their own passions, find their own voice. And that is not how you get elected to anything. What about you? Do you think you'd be a good politician?
Scarily, I think that I could pull it off, but I think that I would get exhausted from it.
Yeah, you pull it off for maybe one term, right?
Yeah, I think I could serve 2 years in the House, and I would either be totally corrupted, or I would just have had enough of it.
Yeah. No, I see you making one final corrupt deal, and then just
peace it out.
And move into Fiji or something like that.
I'm going to go on the speaking tour and make my real money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I know for me, when it comes to integrity and honesty, I go back to one of the episodes that we did on the 4 agreements.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
And the very first one is be impeccable with your word. And I hear, you and I have talked about this a lot. Precision with our language. What do we mean? Are we meaning what we mean? Are we saying what we mean? Are we being clear? Because I think clarity is kind to people. And when people are using vagaries and equivocations and basically manipulating other people to think that they're answering the question without actually answering it, to me, there's something going on there that is more than just manipulative. We're all manipulating. A good therapist will manipulate someone to hopefully, into self-discovery and, better life. But so manipulation isn't bad in and of itself, and we all do it. But when I hear someone kind of doing that sort of thing, I think immediately that trust is broken. Because when we're trafficking words, we are communicating that useful fiction. We're communicating ourselves. We're communicating our being to others. And that comes across not just in the words that we say, but the tone, the timing, all of that. And for me, it's super important to be impeccable with my word, because as I crispen that up, the product is internal peace. I feel more peaceful because I'm no longer trying to juggle a bunch of stories as I'm trying to manipulate how other people see me. So I'm curious about what you might think about the impeccable with our word, how that aligns.
First, if I can butter you up, Joel, I mean, one thing I would say that I really appreciate about you is you have a hard-fought command of the English language, but you don't use it in ways that create distance and hierarchies between you and other people. So I really appreciate that about you. I think about how people. I look to sort of like a Christopher Hitchens in the way that he used words that I really admired, which was this. He used the simplest and best vocabulary that he could, and when the time came to use a word that isn't a commonly used word, but it was the word that he exactly needed to use. He wasn't trying to create distance between himself and the audience. He was inviting them to up their game, to learn words that were germane to the conversation. So we can use, and we know when we're doing it too, we can use words to showcase how much we've learned and the extent of our education. Or we can choose to have a simplicity of language that also picks words that aren't used as often but are the exact right word. And you know how wonderful it is when you listen to somebody and it's like they've got the thesaurus right there, and they're about to get to that word, and they just shift room at the last moment. They use this beautiful word. And I think that's what we should strive for, is to have the kind of vocabulary that allows our thoughts to get communicated to other people in ways that are truthful and persuasive, that don't create distance but bring people closer. And sometimes that closeness might be that other person saying, I want to learn that word because I know that you're using it in an honest way. But if you constantly violate people's trust by using multisyllabic words just to sound intelligent, then they're going to stay at arm's length, and they're going to think of you as this person in an ivory tower that maybe they fear and revere, but not somebody that they sense is really communicating with them.
Yeah, that's well said. Well said. I know that phrase. I know that with the phrase "fewer better words" is something I think is a very great like maxim for everyone to consider. How do I get fewer better words? So that kind of wraps things up. Any final thoughts here, Trent, as we talk about, have we talked about the various ways everyone is lying?
I think I might add a little asterisk here to say, if it seems like we're picking on Jordan Peterson, and or if you see me sort of mocking his voice, something that I hold is very, very important to our public discourse is when somebody becomes a very powerful public figure, that warrants them taking quite a lot of criticism, whether or not and mockery too. I think parodying and funny impersonations and impressions of our public figures, right or left, conservative, Republican, Christian or non, the more powerful people become, the more they shouldn't be harmed, they shouldn't be maligned, but the more that their speech is subject to our critique, and the more that it's good to poke fun at them, because we should all be afraid of becoming more powerful than we should be. So I just say that as a disclaimer. Joel, you and I know we're not trying to like tear him down, because we affirm the things that we think he does well. But this is a guy who is very powerful and very, very prominent, and that those kind of public intellectuals need to be held accountable. For the ideas that they promulgate. So
agreed. Very much so.
Yeah.
All right, my friends. In Trent's final description there, the kind of asterisk he offered, please know that we are still heavily invested into unpopular opinions and having that alchemy play out. Thank you, friends, for joining this episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Hope to see you next time.
Peace.